Welcome to the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast. Thomas Miller, Robert Glasscock. I'm really excited about something. We are going to put together a program that I think is going to be as beneficial to you using astrology as about anything we could create, and it's not something that a lot of people have probably touched. This is spawned from the unique perspective of Robert Glasscock and how he looks at a chart and how he does readings. But one of the things that a lot of us have, you might have it, I have it in my chart, a lot of people have this, is what we are going to be calling conflicted mutables. Now, that's a big topic, and there's a lot to discuss here. We're going to scratch the surface and give you an idea of what we're creating here. There is a chart in the show notes. There's a link right at the top. If you click on that, you can see the chart and follow along with what we're talking about here. But Robert, why don't you walk us into this whole concept of conflicted mutables?
Okay, you're absolutely right. A lot of people have this. In this chart, for example, you've got the Sun and Mercury in Pisces, and they're both in a T-square with Mars in Gemini, and Mars is opposite the Moon in Sag. So you've got the lights squared. The Sun and Moon are the lights. They're in square. They're in conflict at birth. And think about squares. They are absolutely aspects of conflict. Usually the elements, the two elements, are out of whack. Here, for example, we have the Sun in a water sign in Pisces, square the Moon in a fire sign. Fire and water is steam. You have Mars in Gemini, an air sign. The Sun is in Pisces, a water sign. Air and water don't mix. Earth and water mix. Fire and air mix. So this person's fire sign Moon mixes well with his or her Mars in Gemini, fire and air. Fire needs oxygen. But these planets, the Sun and the Moon, are the lights. They're the most important planets in the chart. And they're both in square or opposition with Mars in Sag. Now, when you have 1, 2, 3, 4 planets in mutable signs, and they are what we call afflicted, they're in a stress aspect, you have the beginnings of what can literally be borderline personality disorder or bipolarity. And in many cases, those things are never diagnosed. But they can absolutely wreak havoc on a life until they are diagnosed and treated. And they can be treated. But what you have when you have mutables like this is basically multiple personalities within the individual fighting each other. And they will tend to project those internal fights externally, so that in their lives, what that will look like is a lot of instability and a lot of anger and a lot of drama, usually over very petty things, because they are constantly angry, anxious, upset, frustrated, panicked. And this can lead to things like anxiety attacks and panic attacks, asthma, breathing issues, on and on and on, nervous disorders. Because they have, in essence, and this is not necessarily a psychiatric diagnosis of multiple personalities, but metaphysically it is. These are people who have a lot of, especially with the Sun in Pisces, a lot of porosity, and this is emotional porosity, porousness, sensitivity to past lives, and not only past lives, but emotional sensitivity to everybody and everything in this life. They're sensitive to the barometric pressure where they live. They're very sensitive to environmental pollutants. They're sensitive to the emotional tones of the people around them, so that they can pick up and absorb other people's emotional tones. So therefore, who they associate with in life becomes very important. For example, if they're raised in an alcoholic or drug-addicted family, that's going to contaminate them from birth. and predispose them to all of the sorts of behaviors and end results that are associated with addictive personalities. This is also an escapist chart, people who escape responsibility for their speech and their actions and who blame other people. It was his fault. It was her fault. It's never their fault. And alcohol and drugs are a way to escape responsibility. Oh, I didn't mean it. I was drunk. Well, you did it and you said it. So you can use being drunk as an excuse. But at some point, you have to take responsibility for your drinking. So it's basically an issue of responsibility in this chart. And first of all, to his or herself. And by responsible, I mean acknowledging that they have a multiplicity of selves at war with each other. Now, this can be incredibly constructive if they find a creative or professional outlet for it. You can look in the past and an artist like Van Gogh, for example, who never sold a painting in his life, died a pauper, and nobody bought his work, cut off his ear, mentally a very unbalanced man. But look at his artwork. Genius. But never recognized in his life. And his personal life was also a mess. But if these people can find, and here's the tragedy of some of this, you can use Van Gogh as an example. If he had lived today and had gotten into therapy or had gotten onto lithium, he might not have been the artist that he was. I can think of somebody else a little more contemporary that relates to that same thing. A singer back in the 50s and 60s named Connie Francis. Constance Franconero was her name, an Italian daughter from Newark, New Jersey, from a very strict Italian family, who had a string of unparalleled hit records and had an amazing voice. But she was also diagnosed eventually with bipolarity. She was also raped in a motel room in a city, I believe, in New Jersey, West Haven, Connecticut, I guess, where she was performing, and she was staying at the Howard Johnson, and she was raped in her room randomly. She was not chosen. The rapist didn't know who she was. But she was held in this room for hours under knife point with this guy, and she managed to survive. But her life fell apart after that. And she ultimately got diagnosed with bipolarity and was put on lithium. But she didn't sing for years. And when she finally did return to singing and was able to get her voice back, she found that the only way she could perform was to be taken off the lithium. She didn't have the voice otherwise, which is a fascinating dilemma with a chart like this, because at the same time that creativity, writing, painting, singing, dancing, whatever it is, can be a really constructive outlet to the point of genius, that genius may not manifest if it's controlled by drugs or by therapy. So it is a real dilemma in life. And these people become, eventually, a person like this one, they become addicted to the drama and the crisis and the constant argument and the constant instability. They have no concept of what life, they think life, in a stable life, would be boring, that they would literally die of boredom if things settled down or got, quote unquote, normal. So it can take a lot of extensive therapy to work through a chart like this. And one astrological reading isn't going to do it. It can certainly acquaint the person with their assets and liabilities, but it's not the same as a year's worth of psychotherapy, or if indeed they have a biochemical problem like bipolarity, astrology certainly is not going to replace lithium or medications. But this is what you can get out of a chart like this, and much of this is related to sex in this chart. The Sun and Mercury are in the 8th house of sex in a double sign, Pisces. They may indeed be bisexual. Connie Francis was raised by an incredibly strict Catholic father. She fell in love with the singer Bobby Darin and would have given anything to marry him. but her father, protecting her virtue, came at Bobby Darin with a gun. That's how strict he was. She was raised in this hyper-religious atmosphere that was very condemning of sex and very controlling of women, very patriarchal, and it affected her entire life. So in this chart, you have that sexual component. Mars is the sexual side of love. Mars is lust. Venus is love. So here you have Mars of lust in a double sign, Gemini, square the Sun and Mercury in a double sign, Pisces, an emotional sign, Pisces, in the eighth of sex. And this is a person that can absolutely fall in love with both sexes, and probably does, and probably should. But how do you live in a society where that's condemned? That's also fraught with a lot of judgment and persecution and all of that. And then she's got her moon in a double sign, Sagittarius. It's conflicted at birth. Sagittarius is a sign half human, half animal. So the entire animalistic physical side of sex. Sagittarius is also the sign of religions, remember. The whole animal part of life is condemned. Everything having to do with the flesh is evil. The only real salvation is when you die. Well, that's what a lot of people believe. But in fact, the truth is we are human beings with a great deal of intelligence. Maybe more than any other animal. I'm not sure that's true, but that's what we seem to believe. But the moon, which is women, and if this is a woman, it's her, and if it's a man, it's women in his life. The moon is in Sag, a double sign already conflicted, very much conflicted between virtue and the higher self and lack of virtue in the lower self, between good and evil, and sees things in very black and white. And of course, it loves to argue and debate. And of course, it makes a terrific attorney. Mars in Gemini loves to argue and debate. So this is somebody, male or female, who's at war with themselves on a lot of levels, basically stemming from sex. And therefore, relationships will be fraught all of their lives. It'll be hard for them to ever have a stable relationship unless they get therapy, unless they get well. And these psychological, emotional, spiritual dis-eases are absolutely as serious as any physical illness. And yet people don't treat them because they think psychological sickness is somehow weak. It's not. So, especially with the current transit of Saturn in Pisces now, all of these things are coming to a head and have been for at least a year and a half with this person, because Saturn entered Pisces about a year and a half ago, and it's got another about a year and a half to go until it goes into Aries. So, and this can all of this can lead to legal and financial problems as well. The eighth house is other people's money, opposite the second, and so on. And it leads to vocational and career problems. The 11th house is goals and ambitions. And there's Mars again in Gemini, opposite her moon, square sun. So it's a hugely conflicted chart about everything. And it constantly operates at a tremendous stress level. And so it seeks ease of somehow, an ease or relaxation of somehow. And the only way for people like this to attain it very often is through drinking or sexual addictions or drugs and so on. So this is a tough chart to deal with.
You know, this is a difficult conversation, obviously. It has some heaviness to it. And I'd like to end on a higher note here, that one of the reasons why astrology can help with our lives so much is, let's say that you had this chart, and let's say you had wise parents raising you, and they knew how to identify these things. And this is why we're building the course, because if you get into a relationship, let's say you want to date somebody, potentially marry them, or a business partnership that is comfortable enough, or you know each other well enough that you can look at each other's charts and you see these conflicted or afflicted mutables, then there's a new awareness to that whole situation, that if the person is not following their path and their higher timeline, could save you a whole lot of challenge and agony and angst, and possibly, if it's a relationship, divorce down the road. So the idea here is that we are identifying these things so that we can overcome them, not so that we are dragged into the mud pit for the rest of our lives. Would you agree?
Totally. Same with me. When I first got into this, the very first book I read, I'm reading this A to Z horoscope making delineator written in 1928, the original version. And I'm thinking, my God, I've got a horrible horoscope. And I do. Can I do anything about this? And of course, that is the reason for astrology. Every archetype in astrology has a positive and negative archetype. Now, in this situation, I just read for a repeat client. She's getting involved in a new relationship. It's only a few months old, and they are all ready. They had just made an appointment with a counselor, a therapist. They're 3 months into the relationship, but they are serious about it. They love each other dearly. And so I started talking with her about the differences in their backgrounds and so on that can contribute to the failure of a relationship, and how the communication is everything. And it was in her chart. And I said, I cannot tell you how proud I am and happy I am that both you and this new prospective partner are already going to a counselor, a neutral third party. They're going to have the first interview together, and then they will have a separate interview, each one of them separately with a therapist, and then figure out where to go from there. But that relationship, despite the complexity of the chart, has a great chance of becoming the lasting relationship that they both want. They're not waiting until problems simmer and lack of communication blows everything up like this previous chart we're looking at. And the message underneath this all is, I don't care how bad your chart looks, you can always turn it around, always. But it requires help. I go back, one of the earliest books I read, Thomas, was Swami Paramahansa Yogananda, The Autobiography of a Yogi.
Great book.
And what a wonderful man. And in that book, he says, you show, and he did use astrology, you show me the worst day to start a new business enterprise, and I will start the enterprise on that day, and it will succeed. And he's right.
Yeah.
So if you know what you're doing and you understand what the chart is trying to tell you, the message of the stars, and you can admit your own weaknesses, I've had to. And I took myself to therapy for a whole year. The second best thing I ever did for myself. But you can't do it alone. And in fact, we can't live alone. We're not meant to. Maybe if you're a monk in a cave, but most of us aren't. So interactions and transactions are everything. And that's why in this chart, therapy would be the great thing to go. But it's you can absolutely turn any chart around, and that's the takeaway here.
That is the message, for sure. Well, we're going to build a whole program around this. It is something that shows up in your partner's chart, your kid's chart, like I say, all the way through. And as you start comparing charts with your friends, etc., and you know what to look for, you're going to identify this, and then you can see where these characteristics show up. And the most important thing is, as Robert just said, the awareness that you wake up and you get on a conscious spiritual path and you start to address these things from a high timeline perspective, not the shadow side. And that's how you climb up over these things. And then you soar into the brilliance that this chart has in it as well and bring those characteristics out. So if you'd like to talk to Robert about this, and maybe it's a concern, and maybe you're on the brink of a relationship, a budding new relationship like this client he just worked with, contact him through the email link in the show notes. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.